When did you have to choose between two lives? When I was 29, I got a DNA match notification on an ancestry site I had signed up for on a whim 2 years earlier, and the match was listed as close family, predicted sibling, and the name attached to the profile was Theo, and I had no sibling named Theo. My parents had told me my whole life that I was an only child, and I had no reason to disbelieve them. And then I was sitting at my desk on a Tuesday afternoon looking at the face of a man who shared 90% of my DNA, and was, according to the site's algorithm, almost certainly my twin. Theo had sent a message along with the match, careful and short, that said he had known about me for 2 years, and had taken a long time deciding whether to reach out, that he did not want to disrupt my life, and that if I wasn't ready to connect he understood, but that if I was, he would be glad to hear from me. I sat with the message for 3 days. I didn't tell my parents. Something in me understood immediately that their reaction was going to be complicated, and I wanted to talk to Theo first. I wrote back. We moved to email, then phone, then video calls, and by the end of the first month we were talking almost every day, and by the end of the second I was keeping a relationship with my twin brother from my own parents, which was the first time in my life I had genuinely led a double life. Theo had grown up 4 states away with adoptive parents he loved. He was steady, thoughtful, funny in a dry way that I recognized immediately as something I also was. The resemblance was surreal. He sent me a photo of himself at 25, and it was closer to a mirror than anything I had ever seen, and I had to sit down. He had found out he was adopted at 19 and had spent years researching before the DNA site connected him to me. He had not contacted my parents. He had not contacted any of my family. He had waited to see what I wanted. I want you to understand what this meant to me. He had found me, known about me for 2 years, and chosen to let me lead. Nobody in my family had ever done that. I finally told my parents 8 weeks in. I sat them down and showed them the DNA results, and what happened next told me everything. My mom cried immediately. My dad went very still, and before I could say anything else, before I could even ask the question, my dad said, "We were told the adoption was closed and that contact wasn't permitted," and the sentence had the sound of something that had been prepared, not improvised, prepared, ready for this specific conversation. I asked why they had never told me I had a twin. My mom said they had thought it would be easier, that the agency had advised them not to, that they had been so young and so afraid. My dad said less, which told me more, because my dad is a man who speaks precisely when he has something to say, and goes quiet when he is managing something he hasn't resolved. There were things my mom said that she immediately softened and redirected, questions my dad didn't answer clearly, tiny fractures in what was supposed to be a unified story. I went home and called Theo, and Theo was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "There's something I've been waiting to tell you until you'd talk to them." And he told me he had contacted the adoption agency 2 years ago, and that the agency had a file, and that the file contained a document that contradicted what my parents had just told me in a specific and important way. The agency had not advised against contact. The agency had no record of my parents being told anything about a closed adoption, because the paperwork in the file showed that my parents had initiated the separation, not the agency, and that they had signed a document citing financial hardship. But the clause they had agreed to was not a closed adoption. It was a voluntary relinquishment with a right of contact provision, meaning Theo had been legally entitled to contact my family since he turned 18, and someone had never told him. Theo had found me anyway, through a database, 11 years later than he was supposed to be able to. The dumber they think I am, the more rope they'll hand me. Theo sent me a scan of the original relinquishment form. All the signatures were there, my parents' names, the date, the clauses. I was looking at the proof that Theo existed, and that someone had decided he didn't need to know it. At the bottom of the form, in the section for additional notes, someone had written 4 words in handwriting I recognized, and the handwriting was my father's, and the 4 words were, "He will be fine." And I'm still deciding whether that sentence was about Theo or about me, and which answer I can live with. I needed to talk to my mother alone, without my father in the room. I had watched her almost say something the night I showed them the DNA results. She had been talking about why they gave Theo up, and she had said the word wanted, and then something shifted behind her eyes, and she softened the sentence and turned it into something else, something safer. And my dad had watched her do it and said nothing, which meant he knew what she had almost said and was glad she hadn't. I picked a Thursday while I knew my dad was at work. I drove over around 10 in the morning, and when Nimue opened the door, she looked surprised. She let me in and offered me coffee the way she always does, and I sat down at the kitchen table and I said, "Mom, I need you to tell me what you were going to say the other night before you stopped yourself." Her face changed, just a tightening around her mouth. She said, "I don't know what you mean." I pushed, but gently. I said, "You started to say something about why you gave Theo up. You said the word wanted and then you changed direction. I need to hear the rest of that sentence." Nimue stood by the counter and she looked at the floor and she looked at the window and she looked everywhere except at me, and I could see how torn she was. She said, "Your father and I agreed we would tell you the same thing." And I felt something cold settle in my chest because that sentence told me everything I needed to know. I said, "Mom, that sentence right there tells me you two rehearsed a story. I need the truth." Nimue started crying. Not the way she had cried when I first told them about Theo, which was sudden and messy. This was different. This was slow and tired, like she had been holding something heavy for a very long time, and her arms were finally giving out. She sat down across from me and she said, "It wasn't both of us. It wasn't a decision we made together. Your father went to the agency. I found out after. I came home from the hospital, and there was 1 baby instead of 2, and he told me it was already done. I don't think I moved. I don't think I breathed. I just sat there and stared at my mother and tried to process what she had just said. I asked, 'You didn't agree to it?' Nimue wiped her eyes and said, 'I signed the form after. He said we couldn't afford 2, that the other family was good, that it was already arranged. I was 22. I had just given birth. I didn't know I could fight it." She grabbed my hand and her grip was tight, almost too tight, and she said, "I have thought about Theo every single day of your life. Every birthday, I thought about both of you." Her voice cracked on the word both, and I had to look away because I could feel my own eyes burning. I asked her why she never told me. She said, "Because your father said it would only cause pain, and I believed him. And by the time I stopped believing him, it had been so many years that the lie felt like it was holding everything together." I drove home with the windows up and the radio off and called Theo. I told him everything Nimue had said. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, so it was him, just him. I said, that's what she's telling me. Theo let out a breath that sounded like it had been sitting in his lungs for years. Then his voice got steady and firm, and he said, I need to meet him. I need to be in the same room as the man who decided I wasn't worth keeping. I picked Saturday morning. I drove over early, banking on Johnny being in the garage because that's where he goes every Saturday. He has a workbench in there and a radio, and he tinkers with things. It's his version of being alone. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a minute, just breathing. I got out and walked to the garage, and there he was, standing at the workbench with his back to me, sorting through a drawer of screws or bolts. The radio was on low, some talk station. I stood in the doorway and I said, Dad, I talked to Mom. Alone. She told me you went to the agency by yourself. She told me she came home to one baby. Johnny's hand stopped moving. He didn't turn around. He just stood there with his fingers resting on whatever he had been holding, and the only sound was the low murmur of the radio. Then he said, your mother is remembering it the way she needs to. His voice was flat, not angry, not sad, flat, like he was reading a line he had already written in his head. I said, Dad, I have the form. I have your handwriting. The agency has no record of a closed adoption. You need to stop managing this and just tell me what happened. He finally turned around. His face was tight and controlled, jaw set, eyes steady, like a man who has decided exactly how much he is going to give and not one word more. He said, you don't understand what it was like. We were 22. We had nothing. I made a decision. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. And I did it because I didn't see another way. I said, you didn't let Mom choose. Johnny's jaw tightened and he said, she would have said keep both. And then what? We lose the house? We can't feed either of them? I did what I thought was right. His voice cracked on the last word. Just barely. Just enough that I heard it, and I watched something move across his face that I had never seen before. He looked old. The weight of this thing had been pressing down on him for so long that it had worn grooves into him I was only now close enough to see. For a moment I almost softened. I thought maybe this was just a scared kid who made a bad call under impossible pressure and had been carrying it ever since. Maybe forgiveness is the path here. Maybe this family survives this. Then Johnny said, and I need you to stop talking to him. I blinked. I said, what? Johnny straightened up and his face changed again, the pain folding back behind something harder. He said, this Theo, he's stirring things up. He's pulling this family apart. I need you to end the contact. I stared at my father. I could feel something that had been leaning toward understanding pull back and go cold. I said, he's my brother, Dad. He's your son. Johnny shook his head, slow and firm, and said, he was raised by good people. He had a good life. I made sure of that, but he is not part of this family, and bringing him in now is going to destroy everything. I stood there and I looked at him and I finally understood. My father was not sorry. He was not holding 30 years of guilt. He was holding 30 years of fear. The pain I had seen, the crack in his voice, that was real, but it wasn't regret. It was the terror of a man who feels the walls closing in. As long as Theo was out there somewhere, living a separate life, never contacting us, the decision stayed buried. But now Theo had a face and a voice and a name I said out loud in this house. And every time I said it, the thing Johnny had buried got closer to the surface. He wasn't trying to protect the family. He was trying to protect the story he had told himself about who he was. I didn't say any of that to him. I just looked at my father for a long time, and then I turned around and walked back to my car, and I sat there in the driveway, shaking, not a little tremble in my hands. My whole body, arms, legs, jaw, like something inside me had come loose and was rattling around trying to find where it used to fit. I made it 4 blocks before I pulled over on a side street and called Theo. I told him everything. I told him about the garage and the workbench and the moment I had almost believed him. And then I told him what Johnny said at the end. I told him our father had looked me in the face and told me to stop talking to my own brother. Theo's voice went flat. He said, he told you to stop talking to me. I said, yes. Theo said, and are you going to? I said, no, not a chance. Whatever was left of the version of me that deferred to my father, that trusted his judgment, that assumed he had reasons I just couldn't see, that version was gone. It had died in a garage somewhere between, it was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I need you to end the contact. I went back to my parents' house the next morning. Nimue was alone. I stood in the kitchen and said, Mom, I want to bring Theo here, to the house. I want him to meet you and Dad, face to face, all of us in the same room. Nimue's face went white. She put her hand on the counter to steady herself and said, your father will never agree to that. I said, I'm not asking him to agree. I'm telling you it's happening. Theo has a right to see where he was born. He has a right to meet the people who made the choice. Nimue opened her mouth and closed it, and I could see 2 things fighting inside her at the same time. She said, I want to meet him. I've wanted to meet him for 29 years, but your father, if you force this, he might not come back from it. I looked at my mother and I said, Mom, he gave away your baby without your full consent. The question isn't whether Dad comes back from this. It's whether you do. She stood there by the counter with her hand still braced against it, and I watched her face move through something I couldn't name, something that looked like 30 years of silence finally running out of room. Then Nimue took a breath and straightened her shoulders and said, Sunday. Bring him Sunday. I'll make sure your father is home. Sunday morning I drove to the airport. Theo's flight landed at 9. I stood near the arrivals area and watched people come through the doors, families hugging, couples finding each other, and then Theo came out pulling a small carry-on, and he saw me and walked over, and neither of us made a big deal of it. He just fell into step beside me and we walked to the car. He was wearing a button-down shirt, dark blue, tucked in like he had thought about what to wear, and landed on something that said, I'm taking this seriously without trying too hard. His hands were steady at his sides, but his jaw was tight. That same set I had seen on video calls when he was working through something he didn't want to talk about yet. We drove toward my parents' house mostly in silence, not uncomfortable silence, just the kind of quiet that happens when 2 people both know what's coming and there isn't much left to say about it that hasn't already been said. I parked on the street and turned the engine off, and Theo leaned forward a little and looked through the windshield at the front door. He stared at it for a long time. Then he said, I used to imagine this house. I used to wonder what it looked like, what it smelled like, whether there were pictures of me somewhere. I looked at the front door too, at the faded welcome mat and the porch light that Johnny never remembers to change when it burns out, and I said, there aren't. I looked. Theo nodded, slow, like he had expected that answer and had already made his peace with it a long time ago. Then he took a breath put his hand on the door handle, and said, "Let's go." I opened the front door, and Nimue was standing in the hallway. She must have been waiting there, maybe for minutes, maybe longer, because she was perfectly still until she saw us, and then she saw Theo, and her hand went to her mouth, and she made a sound I have never heard my mother make in my entire life, something between a gasp and a sob, raw and broken and full of something that had been locked away for 3 decades. She said, "Oh my God, you look just like him." She meant me. She was looking at Theo and seeing me and seeing him and seeing both of us at once, and her whole body was shaking. Theo stood in the doorway and he said, "Hi, Nimue." He didn't call her mom. She didn't ask him to. She crossed the hallway in 3 quick steps and put her arms around him and held on tight like she was afraid he would disappear again if she let go, and Theo let her. He didn't pull back. He didn't stiffen. He just stood there and let my mother hold the son she lost 30 years ago, and I had to look away because the grief in that hallway was so heavy I could barely breathe. We walked into the living room. Johnny was already standing near the couch with his hands at his sides, and when Theo walked in, I watched my father's face do something complicated. Recognition first, because Theo looks like me and I look like Johnny, and then fear and then guilt, and then the mask coming down like a window being shut. Johnny looked at Theo and said, "So you're Theo." Theo looked right back at him and said, "And you're the man who gave me away." The room went very still. Nimue sat down on the nearest chair. I stayed standing. Johnny said, "I did what I thought was best for everyone." Theo didn't blink. He said, "You did what was best for you. I've read the file. I've seen the form. You didn't consult your wife. You picked one baby and let the other one go, and then you spent 30 years making sure nobody found out." Johnny tried to redirect. He said, "You had a good life. Your parents loved you." Theo said, "My parents are wonderful people. That's not the point. The point is, you made a choice you had no right to make alone, and then you buried it." Johnny's eyes moved to me. He said, "Are you going to let him talk to me like this in my own house?" I looked at my father and I said, "Dad, he's not saying anything that isn't true. I've seen the file. I've seen your handwriting. You wrote, 'He will be fine,' at the bottom of the form. I need you to tell me what that meant." Something cracked in Johnny's face. Just slightly, just enough. He sat down. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I held him." Nimue looked up. She said, "What?" Johnny wasn't looking at any of us. He was looking at the floor. He said, "At the hospital, before the agency came, I asked the nurse if I could hold him one more time." My whole body went tight. Theo went very still. Johnny said, "I held him for 40 minutes. He fell asleep on my chest. And when the woman from the agency came, I wrote that note because I needed to believe it. I needed to believe he would be fine, because if I thought for 1 second that he wouldn't be, I couldn't have handed him over." The room was silent. Johnny's voice broke. He said, "I have never told anyone that. Not your mother. Not anyone. I held my son, and I gave him away, and I wrote those words so I could live with it. And I have been living with it for 29 years, and it has not gotten easier. Not one single day." Theo's face changed. The hardness didn't leave, but something beneath it moved. Something I couldn't name. He said, "Then why did you tell your son to stop talking to me? If it hurt this much, why did you try to keep us apart again?" Johnny looked at Theo, and then at me, and his eyes were red, and his voice was barely above a whisper when he said, "Because every time he mentioned your name, I heard the sound you made when I handed you to that woman, and I couldn't stand it. I wasn't trying to protect the family. I was trying to protect myself from remembering what I did." Nimue was crying openly, her shoulders shaking, her hands pressed against her face. I sat down next to her and put my hand on her back. Theo remained standing. He looked at Johnny for a long time, long enough that the silence started to feel like its own kind of conversation. Then Theo said, "I don't forgive you. I'm not there yet. Maybe I never will be. But I believe you when you say it cost you something. And I'm done being the secret this family keeps." Johnny nodded slowly. He didn't ask for more than that. I walked Theo out to the car afterward. We stood in the driveway for a while, neither of us saying anything at first. Then Theo said, "That was the hardest thing I've ever done." I said, "Me too." Theo looked at the house one more time and he said, "I don't need them to be my parents. I have parents, but I needed to stop being a ghost." I drove Theo back to the airport. At the terminal, Theo got out and turned back and said, "Same time next month?" I said, "Yeah, same time next month." I drove home and I thought about 2 babies in a hospital 30 years ago, and one man deciding which one stayed and which one left, and the 4 words written at the bottom of a form that were never meant for anyone to read. And I wondered if "he will be fine" was a promise or a prayer, and I decided it doesn't matter because Theo turned out fine anyway, not because of those words, but in spite of them. 2 weeks after the meeting, Theo called me. He said the agency had processed one more record request he had made before the visit. He said there was another file, not his, not mine. He said, "There's a name on it I don't recognize, but the birth date is the same as ours."